I'm Dr. David Bernstein, and welcome back to our series, 7 Secrets of Forensic Chemotherapy. Now, last time we talked about the fact that in forensic chemotherapy, love is not enough, that you need to combine attachment with limits. And today we're going to talk about the third secret of forensic chemotherapy, and that is 2 people in a room. Now, many years ago, when I was starting my randomized clinical trial of forensic chemotherapy in the Netherlands, we started to videotape a lot of our sessions, and that was really very interesting to see what was actually going on. It was in the early stage of the research, and I would frequently look at sessions in the chemotherapy condition and in the treatment as usual condition, where patients were mostly receiving cognitive behavior therapy. And one thing that really struck me, and particularly in the CBT sessions, was the following. I would look at the patient and the therapist talking to each other, and I would see often this. Now, what I would see is 2 talking heads. The therapist talking here, busy in his or her head with all kinds of, rational, intellectual kinds of ideas, and the same thing with the patient. It was really very, very striking. And what I also saw was a lack of real, genuine emotion or genuine contact. And so if you took a look at, the patient and the therapist, what you saw is that both of them were in a detached protector mode. Now, we know there are different varieties of detached protector modes. Some of them are, more numb, some of them more rational or intellectual, some of them more avoidant. But what was very striking here was that in either case, that characterized not only the patient, but also the therapist. And so it really was a situation of 2 talking heads and very little connection from the heart. Now, how do you explain this? Well, I think there are a number of factors that come into play. One is that, the emphasis in many forensic institutions is on patients controlling their behavior. And when, patients have problems in regulating emotions, one way in which they can control their behavior is just simply shutting their emotions off. Tuning out to their feelings, which, when they get triggered, they can sometimes lead to, anger and aggression. So they kind of shut those feelings off and avoid people and situations that trigger them. And then what's very interesting then is, how do you explain the fact that, the therapist in the situation is also frequently, in a detached state and clearly not recognizing that? Well, part of the reason is that, the patient is talking about things that have very little emotional resonance, talking about practical matters, or even when the patient is asked to talk about things that, have potential significance, family issues, difficulties they're having in the institution, they're doing so in a kind of distant way, okay, as if somehow they're not really talking about themselves. Okay, as if they might as well be talking about somebody else. And when somebody is in that kind of state, that kind of detached state, session after session after session, it can have a numbing effect on the therapist too. Without realizing it, the therapist can slowly enter into a detached state as well. Now, what are some of the indications of this? Well, I don't know if you've ever, had a patient like this where, you found yourself working very hard to find topics, meaningful topics to talk about. Even before the session, you may feel like, what are we going to talk about today? You might feel a little bit anxious about that, and as if somehow it's on you, the therapist, to come up with something meaningful to discuss. Okay, so that's just one indication. But I think also that there are, in addition to the fact that we sometimes, unconsciously can flip into emotional states that mirror those of our patients, that there are other factors going on as well. And those are systemic factors. And that is that, among other things, let's say the patient is, quote, doing well in treatment. He's following the program. He's obeying the rules. He's not getting into trouble. Well, naturally, there's a tendency on the patient's part, as well as on our parts, to see this as being, positive, as indicating that the patient is progressing through treatment. Now, I'm not suggesting that, the patient should be, punished or criticized for the fact that he's not acting out and, breaking rules and getting into trouble. But what I do think is that there is a kind of implicit conspiracy sometimes. I don't mean, explicit, but really implicit conspiracy between the patient and the therapist and the institution, that as long as things are progressing in this way, we're not going to rock the boat. And in my opinion, what happens is, so I think it's on the one hand, it's very understandable, that the institution and that we want to see the patient succeed. We want to succeed. And so, on some unconscious level, there is a kind of, conspiracy to not open things up, to not rock the boat, And so what happens? Well, the patient goes through the program and ticks off all the boxes. And then sometimes what happens is that when the patient starts transitioning back into the community, and particularly at the phase where they're spending time in the community where they're not being supervised, that's where things go wrong. And they can go very wrong. And why is that? Because the underlying emotional issues have just never been dealt with, right? So the treatment has, again, taken place up here at a kind of rational, intellectual level. The patient can talk very well about his triggers, and you can make nice relapse prevention plans, but somehow that hasn't really touched the patient emotionally. Nothing really fundamental has changed. Okay, so then what is missing in such a treatment? Well, I think that fundamentally what is missing is attachment. Okay, so if you think about it, we've discussed this before, that our patients, many of them come from very traumatized backgrounds, or backgrounds where they never had the opportunity to form a secure attachment. And so what they do instead is they develop modes in order to cope whenever they're in a situation that feels at all, threatening. And so, one of those modes, and actually I think it's the most common modes that I see in forensic institutions, the most common mode actually is the detached protector mode. You'd think that it was a mode involving anger or aggression, and yes, those do occur, and they're very dramatic when they do. But I think that most of the time our patients are in a detached protector mode. And it makes sense. This is a way in which patients, survive or cope, in institutional settings. And it's probably a mode that they developed at a much younger stage of life to help them cope with all the overwhelming things that were going on in their lives. Okay, so it's not surprising that then they fall back on this form of coping too, especially given the fact that it is seen as positive and is reinforced in institutional settings. And so again, what's missing is some genuine human contact. The idea that that patient could slowly begin to feel safe enough and trusting enough to begin to lower that wall and let his therapist and other people see who's behind that wall. See the pain, see the rage, all the messy stuff that's difficult, And so what schema therapy offers that I think really is different than most approaches that are used in the forensic field is that it offers the possibility of attachment. And we know that that's not easy in these kinds of patients. So that's why we've developed a kind of systematic approach to help you, the therapist, work with the modes that stand in the way, like a detached protector mode. If you want more information about that, you can go, to the previous video series I made, 25 Tips for Working with Modes, which talks about a number of the different kinds of techniques that we use in order to foster an attachment relationship and how we cope with it when, heavy-duty modes stand in the way of getting closer to the patient. But fundamentally, we also have to think about what is it like for us to be in a room with someone who is so detached, but also someone where we know that somewhere lurking in the background are all kinds of painful feelings, but also anger, potential for violence, and so forth. What is it like for us to be with the patient? Because fundamentally, I believe that fundamentally therapy is about two people in a room. That's the basis of it. It's two people in a room. It fundamentally is about, encountering each other as human beings. And when we're dealing with patients, often, let's say, outside of forensic settings, patients who might be more anxious or more depressed, these may be things that are uncomfortable sometimes for us. But at the same time, if it has to do with, somewhat healthier patients, it's much easier for us to relate to them, much easier for us to connect with them. But what is it like when we're in a room with somebody who has, the potential for violence or the potential to con or manipulate us, or is keeping us at some kind of a distance? What is that like? What does that feel like to us? And I think this is the crucial point, that we need to bring awareness to our own experience. That it's by default, when we're feeling uncomfortable, we tend to flip into some kind of coping modes ourselves, sometimes dysfunctional ways of coping. And it can be extremely uncomfortable when patients are keeping us at a distance. We're social animals, and we need that kind of human contact. So it's not surprising that we then flip into often more detached modes ourselves. So what do you do about that? Well, the first thing to do is simply to pay attention to your own experience. What is it like right now for me? This patient, I'm looking at the patient, I see this, detached mode of the patient, this detached side. What is my experience right now? How am I feeling right now? What's going on in my head? Do I notice the fact that I'm not feeling anything? Do I notice the fact that my mind is drifting? Do I notice the fact that, my mind is working really hard to try to figure out what to do right now? Okay, these are all indications, that the therapist is also in a detached state. So I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't, feel those ways or try to cope in these ways. But the moment that you start to bring some mindful awareness to your experience, just noticing it and paying attention to it, your own mode begins to change. It begins to soften a little bit. And you have then, the chance to start to come back and get in touch with yourself and ask yourself the fundamental question, what am I feeling right now? What is my experience right now? Okay, so that's really, the foundation of everything. And because how can I help the patient attach to me if I'm not attached to myself at that moment? Okay, so that's why secret number 3 is that forensic schema therapy is all about two people in a room. Now, if you'd like more information about our courses or about supervision in forensic schema therapy, please feel free to write me at info@safepath-solutions.com. Or if you'd like to take a look at more of the images that you saw in this video, please go to our iModes website, www.imodes.com. Have a great day and see you next time.